Welcome to this deep dive, which is actually proudly part of the podcast O Dromos Ekidititu Historia by Giannis Stefanidis.
Which translates to, the street has its own history.
Right, exactly. Now, I want you to imagine you are walking down a city street. Usually, you aren't really thinking about the asphalt under your shoes, right?
No, of course not. You're thinking about grabbing a coffee or avoiding traffic.
Yeah, or maybe just checking your phone. But today, we're asking you to really look at the street signs. Like, specifically, picture yourself walking down Philippoupoleos Street.
Right, in the Ampelokipi neighborhood of Thessaloniki.
Exactly. And, it looks like a typical bustling modern road. There are bakeries, apartment buildings, kids on bicycles. But that name on the green street sign, it holds a 2,300-year-old secret.
It really does. It's an incredible historical footprint.
We are going to uncover how this single road in modern Greece anchors the legacy of, an ancient Macedonian king.
And a thriving lost homeland in modern-day Bulgaria.
Right, and the unbreakable spirit of refugees who carry their city's memory across closed borders.
Because to understand why this specific street in Ampelokipi even exists, we have to trace the name back to its source, right? The majestic city of Philippoupolis.
Or as you'll find it on modern maps today, Plovdiv?
Yes, in Bulgaria. And the timeline of this place is just staggering.
How far back are we talking?
Well, long before the Greeks established a major presence, there was an ancient Thracian settlement on this site. It was called Eumolpia.
Okay, Eumolpia.
Yeah, and there's evidence of human habitation there stretching back to, like, the 6th millennium BC.
Wow, that is ancient.
Right. But the real pivot point for our specific narrative happens a bit later, in 342 BC.
Okay, so what happens in 342 BC?
That is when Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, conquered the settlement.
Ah, Philip of Macedon. Makes sense, given the name.
Exactly. He didn't just conquer it, though. He heavily fortified it, expanded its borders, and in a classic move of ancient branding, named it after himself.
Philippoupolis.
You guessed it.
I was actually looking through the historical notes on that specific era, and I found this hilarious, almost unbelievable rumor about what Philip II did with this newly named city.
Oh, the Plutarch claim.
Yes. So ancient writers, primarily Plutarch, claimed that Philip intentionally populated the city with the absolute worst people he could find in his empire.
Right. Basically an ancient penal colony.
Yeah. We're talking criminals, corrupt lawyers, false witnesses, and just, general scoundrels. It supposedly even earned the nickname Paneropolis.
Which translates to the city of rogues.
Right. But, wait, is Plutarch actually a reliable source here? Because he was Greek and Philip is Macedonian. Is it possible this is just, ancient Athenian smear campaign propaganda?
Well, that is a very sharp question to ask. You always have to consider the source in antiquity.
Right. Everybody had an agenda.
Exactly. Plutarch was writing centuries later, and there was certainly a long tradition of Greek writers attempting to paint the Macedonians as, tyrannical or uncivilized.
So it might just be a heavy-handed political smear.
It might be. But whether it was a genuine imperial policy to create a penal colony or just a smear, the reputation definitely stuck in the literature.
It's a great story, either way, like an ancient Gotham.
Right. But if it ever was a city of rogues, the geography alone ensured it couldn't really stay that way.
Because it was just too valuable of a location to leave to the criminals, I assume.
Precisely. Philippoupolis sits in this highly strategic valley. It's built across multiple hills and bisected by the Maritsa River.
Okay, so prime real estate.
Absolutely. By the time the Roman Empire absorbed the region, the city, which was then known as Trimontium, or the City of Three Hills, was positioned perfectly on the Via Militaris.
Great Roman road, right?
Yes, connecting the Balkans to the Middle East. That geographical mechanism completely transformed it. It stopped being an outpost and became this massive economic hub.
And you can still see evidence of that Roman wealth today, right?
Yeah, there is a massive, spectacularly preserved Roman theater right in the center of the modern city.
That's incredible. And that economic momentum seems to have just snowballed over the centuries.
It really did. Through the Byzantine era, it remained a heavily contested prize for emperors and marching armies.
But the sources we have point to the 18th and 19th centuries as a massive turning point, specifically for the Greek population living there.
Oh, the 18th and 19th centuries were, without a doubt, a true golden age for the Greek community in Philippoupolis.
How so? What were they doing?
Well, during the Ottoman era, Greek merchants managed to position themselves as the primary economic drivers of the entire region.
So they weren't just running like local corner shops.
No, not at all. They were managing massive trade networks that extorted goods all the way to Vienna and even further.
Wow, so real international trade.
Exactly. And this influx of immense wealth fundamentally changed the urban landscape. These merchants built lavish, ornate mansions.
I read about the cultural institutions too.
Yes, highly influential ones, like the renowned Zarifios School, which became one of the most prestigious Greek educational academies in the broader Balkans.
The wealth must have been just dizzying. The sources actually highlight one specific building that survived all the subsequent historical turmoil.
Ah, the Kudium-Zoglu mansion.
Right, the 1847 mansion of a wealthy Greek merchant named Argyris Kudium-Soglu. I mean, imagine managing a vast European trade empire from a multi-story home like that.
Symmetrical facades, intricately carved wooden ceilings.
Yeah, and indoor courtyard fountains. It sounds almost idyllic.
It was definitely a peak of cultural and economic influence.
Yeah.
And today, that very mansion actually houses Plovdiv's ethnographic museum.
So it serves as this physical, undeniable testament to that Greek golden age.
It does. But as we know, wealth and grand mansions are incredibly fragile when the geopolitical tectonic plates beneath them begin to shift.
Right. And the end of the 19th century brought massive instability to the Balkans.
Yeah.
Golden ages rarely last forever.
They really don't.
Let's look at the mechanics of that shift then. Because this golden age crashes hard into the realities of the 20th century. What actually fractured this community?
Well, it was the rise of competing nationalisms as the Ottoman Empire began to wane.
Okay, so geopolitical shifts.
Exactly. In 1878, following the Russo-Turkish War, the autonomous province of Eastern Rumelia was created, and Philippoupolis was designated as its capital.
Got it. And then Bulgaria stepped in.
Yes, just 7 years later, in 1885, Bulgaria annexed Eastern Rumelia entirely.
Oh, wow. So suddenly you have this wealthy, culturally dominant Greek minority living inside a newly expanding, highly nationalistic Bulgarian state.
Right. The pressure intensified dramatically.
The sources outline a wave of intense anti-Greek violence that eventually erupted, and 1906 serves as this catastrophic turning point.
It was a very dark year.
But why 1906 specifically? Like, what was the spark that ignited this long-standing tension into actual mob violence?
The spark was the broader, escalating conflict known as the Macedonian struggle.
Okay, so conflicts happening further south.
Yes. It was a fierce, often violent contest between Greek, Bulgarian, and other factions over who would control the remaining Ottoman territories in Macedonia.
And the news of those clashes inflamed public sentiment up in Philippoupolis.
Exactly. And we want to be clear, we are just reporting what the historical sources state here, not taking sides on the regional politics of the time, but those tensions boiled over into outright riots.
Right. On July 29th, 1906, a massive, organized mob seized the Greek Orthodox metropolis of Agia Marina.
Yes, they did.
And just to clarify for everyone listening, when we say they seized the metropolis, we are talking about the regional headquarters of the Greek Orthodox Church, correct?
Yes, the absolute administrative and spiritual center of the community.
And during this violent takeover, they severely injured the archimandrite Photios,
Who was the high-ranking priest in charge of the region.
Yeah.
And the violence didn't stop at the church doors.
It spilled out into the streets, right?
It did. It targeted the foundational pillars of the community. 8 Greek schools were looted, along with numerous Greek-owned shops, businesses, and homes.
I want to pause the historical timeline in your head for a second and just focus on the human element of that moment.
It's hard to even imagine.
Right. Imagine standing in the doorway of a beautiful ancestral home, perhaps one just like that 1847 mansion we talked about. You hear the riots in the streets.
Terrifying.
You turn the key in the lock, knowing with absolute certainty you will never, ever see the inside of your home again.
And you have, what, a horse-drawn cart?
If you're lucky. You can only take what you can physically carry. Everything else, the grand wooden ceilings, the prosperous businesses, the graves of your ancestors, is just abandoned.
It is a profound generational trauma. That 1906 violence forced the first major wave of Greeks to flee.
But that wasn't the final blow, was it?
No. The final fatal blow to the community came later, with the 1919 Treaty of Neuilly following World War I.
The Population Exchange Treaty.
Right. This treaty formalized a, quote-unquote, reciprocal voluntary emigration between Greece and Bulgaria.
But the word voluntary is doing a lot of heavy lifting there.
Exactly. The reality on the ground, driven by all that preceding violence and intimidation we just talked about, meant it was effectively a forced population exchange.
The roots were legally and permanently severed.
Yes. Thousands packed whatever fragments of their lives they'd carry onto carts and trains, making their way south across the border into Greece.
Because they were stripped of all their physical wealth, the only things these refugees could bring across the border into Thessaloniki were their memories and their names.
That's right.
And that brings us to the harsh reality of their arrival. Between 1924 and 1925, families from towns in the Philippoupolis diocese, places like Kavakli and Kuklana, arrived in the Ampelokipi area of Thessaloniki.
And they certainly didn't arrive to a ready-made city waiting to welcome them.
Not even close, right?
Yeah. No, the reality of the 1920s for these refugees was brutally difficult. The Greek government was completely overwhelmed by the influx of refugees from various conflicts.
So resources were incredibly thin.
Absolutely bare minimum. In Ampelokipi, the state allocated these families just 500 square meters for a house.
That is tiny for a whole family.
And a small, separate plot of land, usually 4 to 7 stromata, to plant vineyards.
Just to clarify for my own sanity, 4 to 7 stromata, we're talking about roughly an acre or so, right?
Yes, around that.
So not exactly a sprawling agricultural estate.
Barely enough to survive on.
Yeah.
And there was absolutely no infrastructure to support them. No paved roads, no electricity.
And crucially, no running water.
None. The refugees were dumped into empty, muddy fields. To avoid diseases like typhoid, families were literally forced to dig wells by hand.
Digging by hand in the mud.
Relying on manual hand pumps to draw water from the earth just to survive the day.
They were taking empty, muddy fields and turning them into a living neighborhood through sheer, stubborn grit.
That's the perfect way to describe it.
Reading through the historical accounts, there is one personal story that, for me, perfectly encapsulates the psychological weight of this transition.
Are you talking about grandmother Theodora?
Yes, Theodora Purgidu.
Her story is it's a window directly into the refugee experience.
She was born in 1897 in Kavakli, back in that lost homeland. And when she was an old woman in Greece, talking to her grandchild, she vividly remembered her first 7 years of life before the Exodus.
She remembered the sensory details, didn't she?
Exactly. She didn't talk about the geopolitical treaties. She remembered living in a big house with a beautiful fountain in the courtyard.
A stark contrast to a hand pump in a muddy field.
Right. She remembered the excitement of taking trips into the grand, wealthy city of Philippoupoli. And she would look at her grandchild and say, Kortsudi, which means little girl. Kortsudi, you should see that place.
Wow. Think about the mechanics of how humans process and transmit loss.
It's heavy.
When you lose all your physical surroundings, how do you ensure the next generation understands what was taken from them?
You talk about the fountain.
Right. You have this elderly woman trying to transmit the auditory memory of a trickling fountain, the visual memory of a grand merchant city, to a child standing in the dusty, unpaved streets of a 1920s refugee camp.
And that is exactly why naming the street Philippoupoleos was so vital.
It wasn't just an arbitrary choice by some urban planner.
No, it was a deliberate act of defiance against forgetting. They carved the name of their lost capital into the dirt roads of their new reality.
So that every single day, the next generation would walk down it.
And eventually ask, where did we come from?
Exactly. But planting those memories wasn't just happening in Thessaloniki.
Oh, right. That act of geographical defiance happened in other parts of Greece, too.
Yes. If you travel south to the city of Larissa, situated right by the Pinios River, you'll find the neighborhood of Nea Philippoupoli.
New Philippoupoli. Let's compare those two settlements, because they formed under slightly different circumstances, didn't they?
They did. Larissa's neighborhood actually started forming much earlier, around 1906.
Ah, so following that first wave of riots and the looting of the schools we discussed earlier?
Exactly. Ampelokipi in Thessaloniki saw its massive influx slightly later in the 1920s, after the Treaty of Nea formalized the wider exodus.
Different waves of the same tragedy.
Right. And the agricultural landscape in Larissa, fed by the Pinios River, offered a different set of survival challenges compared to the plots in Thessaloniki.
But the fundamental struggle of starting from zero was identical.
Absolutely identical.
It reminds me of how a tree absorbs a piece of barbed wire into its trunk as it grows.
That's a fascinating analogy.
I have these two isolated, struggling refugee camps, one by the river in Larissa, one in the mud of Thessaloniki. Both started with tents, manual water pumps, and desperate poverty.
And as the decades passed, the booming post-war Greek cities expanded outward.
The expanding urban sprawl swallowed the original camps entirely, But that iron memory, the core identity, and the street names remained embedded inside.
It did. The urban regeneration process completely transformed the physical environment.
What did that look like on the ground?
Well, as Thessaloniki grew demographically and economically, the city limits pushed outward. The peripheral, marginalized refugee camps in Ampelokipi were subject to new municipal zoning.
So the muddy paths where refugees once hauled carts of belongings were paved over?
Yes,
Yeah.
municipal water grids and power lines replaced the manual hand pumps.
That must have been a relief, at least.
Of course. And the small, rudimentary brick homes were eventually replaced by the multi-story concrete apartment blocks you see today.
The agricultural plots became commercial real estate.
Exactly. A total transformation.
So if the tree has grown over the wire and the mud has been covered by asphalt and concrete, what can you still physically touch today?
You mean beyond the street signs?
Yeah, like if I'm walking down Philippoupoleos Street in Ampelokipi right now, what tangible anchors of this history survived the urban sprawl?
Even amidst all that concrete, historical anchors remain. If you walk down the street today, you will encounter the Zudakajos PG Church.
The Church of the Life-Giving Spring.
Yes. Construction on this church started in 1931. And it wasn't funded by some wealthy benefactor.
Who built it there?
It was built block by the hands of the refugees themselves, pulling from whatever meager resources they could gather.
They didn't just build a new church, though. They built a shelter for something incredible they managed to smuggle out.
That's right. Safely housed inside Zudakajos PG is the ancient Byzantine icon of Panagia Odigitria.
This wasn't something they purchased in Greece, right?
Not at all. When the mobs were in the streets back in Bulgaria and families were packing those carts, this priceless heirloom, a sacred piece of their heritage, was hidden among their meager belongings.
They guarded it with their lives across the borders.
Because it represented their continuous identity. It survived the Ottoman Empire, the 1906 riots, the forced march, and the poverty of the 1920s to eventually be placed safely in that church on Philippoupoleos Street.
They literally carried their faith and their history across the border.
They really did.
But the history embedded in this street doesn't stop in the 1930s. As we move forward into the 1940s and beyond, the street went on to absorb even more of Greece's modern historical trauma.
It did. Because it was a densely populated working-class refugee neighborhood, it became a natural hotbed of resistance during World War II.
Against the occupation.
Yes. At the intersection of Eleftheria's and Philippoupoleos Streets, you'll find the National Resistance Monument, honoring those locals who fought fiercely against the Nazi occupation.
The neighborhood honors some very specific names tied to this defiance, too, according to the sources.
It honors Socrates Diarinos, a young man from the neighborhood who, in 1941, became the very first university student to be executed by the Nazis in Greece.
Wow. The very first.
Yes. And jumping forward into the turbulent post-war political landscape, there's a plaque on the street marking the spot where a young democratic activist named Stefan Veldemir was assassinated in 1961.
Again, we're just reporting what's physically marked on the street, but it really highlights how active the area remained.
Absolutely.
It is essentially an open-air museum. You walk one block, and you are confronted with the memory of a lost 19th century Greek golden age in Bulgaria, brought over on a cart.
A heavy memory.
Then you walk another block, and you are standing where a university student gave his life fighting fascism. It holds the blood, the tears, and the absolute defiance of modern Greek history all in one continuous stretch of pavement.
Which goes back to your point at the very beginning of our deep dive. We rarely think about the asphalt under our feet.
We just walk on it.
But every layer of Philippoupoleos Street was caved by the struggles, the displacement, and the ultimate resilience of the people who settled there.
The next time you find yourself walking down Philippoupoleos Street in Ampelokipi, I want you to remember that you aren't just walking on a modern road.
You're walking on history.
You are walking across a timeline that spans 2,300 years. It connects the territorial ambition of Philip of Macedon to the opulent mansions of wealthy Greek merchants, to the desperate, freezing carts of refugees fleeing a mob, to a grandmother wishing her grandchild could see the fountains of her youth.
It's all connected right there.
And as promised, I want to reiterate that this deep dive was incredibly proud to be part of the podcast of Dromos Ekitidikitou Historia, The Street Has Its Own History, by Giannis Stefanidis.
I want to leave you with one final thought, actually, something that has been lingering in my mind as we trace this whole journey.
Oh, what's that?
We usually think of a city as a static, physical thing.
Huh.
We define it by its buildings, its walls, its geographic coordinates.
Sure, concrete and glass.
But the story of Philippoupolis shows us that a city is actually a living, breathing organism. Even if you completely uproot it, even if you seize its buildings and force everyone out across a border.
The city doesn't disappear.
Right. As long as its people carry its name, its icons, and its memory, the city doesn't die. It simply relocates, replants itself in new soil, and continues to grow.
A city made of memory outlasting a city made of bricks.
Which leaves me wondering, as you go about your day-to-day, wherever you happen to live, where else in your own city are you walking over invisible, relocated worlds?
Now that is a thought that will stick with you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.